Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast, Setting the Record Straight, Part 1, Our History. We're going to have a good time today. Well, depending on your personality, we're going to have a good time today. Today's episode is either going to greatly amuse you, greatly irritate you, or, to use a popular word, greatly trigger you. So, buckle up. In his novel, 1984, George Orwell said, quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Like many things in this novel, those words have been proven prophetically true. For quite a while now, a certain group has held power, especially within the world of academia. Unfortunately, these zealots, much like the party in the novel 1984, have been devoted to accomplishing their own agendas, unencumbered by a complete lack of any inner conflict that would have arisen if they felt any allegiance to the higher ideal of the truth. Like the villains of this dystopian novel, their real-life counterparts have weaponized the ignorance of people that was created by the passage of time in order to rewrite their history, replacing it with useful propaganda. And they have led the universities and education in general into nuclear fallout levels of destruction. In all fairness to them, they were only able to do this because they were allowed to by us. It is true that in the beginning they hid their malicious intentions, but it is also true that those who knew better knew that these rewrites of the past were a horribly distorted version of history at best, yet they chose to stay silent in the name of politeness. These weak people chose to be nice over being truthful, even though one cannot ever actually be nice while being untruthful and allowing somebody else to be lied to. That is an unkind thing to do. To spare themselves the uncomfortable moments of a confrontation, they sacrifice what should never be sacrificed, the truth. Then, to ease their own consciences for being complicit in a deception, they deluded themselves with reassurances that the zealots didn't act from maliciousness, but rather from good intentions at least, just marred by an incomplete or ignorant point of view at worst. This failure to know their enemy accurately and give the devil his due caused untold damage. And the cowards who did nothing to stop the accumulating catastrophe with all its collateral damage are as much to blame as the malevolent saboteurs who have been ravaging the very foundations of our entire society unchecked. Anyone who molds the minds of the future generations controls what the future will be in a very real way. When we allow zealots who have sold their soul to an ideology to disguise themselves as educators and teach something that is closer to a dystopian fiction as though it is history, something that is more warped and distorted than any gnarled tree in a witch's tale, then the young minds that they mold will likewise be terribly distorted, although hopefully not irrevocably so. History is complicated. Like the present, it is multifaceted and intricate by its very nature. It is most accurate when viewed from many perspectives, including those who actually lived it. This complex, multifaceted nature makes it a challenge to teach history with an accuracy that does it justice. Even those with the purest of intentions, who are sincerely aiming for that mark of objectivity, will fall short in some way. But for those who have completely turned their backs on having such standards to begin with, who are aiming in the other direction completely, at goals of their own devising with no respect for the privilege that has been entrusted to them as educators, or bearing the weight of the responsibility that is implicit and inseparable from such a calling, They spit on all that is sacred and merely add another casualty to the list of treasures they recklessly destroyed out of a devotion to a bad cause. They are like a child in a museum who cannot begin to fathom the value of the things surrounding them, and who therefore feels no remorse for destroying what is irreplaceable, just to gratify their own fleeting, unexamined, and petty whims. But in the end, who is more to blame for the unacceptable results of a tantrum's destruction? The malicious, childish bully destroying everything around him? Or the adults who knew better, but never bothered to stop him? Under all of the other excuses that get made after such a failure, not wanting to cause a fuss, not upsetting others, being nice, being understanding, not making a scene, not making anyone feel uncomfortable, placating the problem for the moment so that things wouldn't get even worse, etc. The root cause under it all is always the same: laziness. We simply didn't want to deal with the awkward trouble it would cause to oppose the rampaging terror of an immature toddler trapped in an adult's body, used as they were to always getting their own way. Ironically enough, in the actual year 1984, Yuri Bezmenov, a Soviet journalist, spoke about the 4 stages used by Marxists to take over a society. They are demoralization, destabilization, creating a crisis, then normalizing the new ideology. He said the first stage takes about 25 years, during which they bombard a society's young people with so much demoralizing untruth that they become unable to distinguish between truth and fiction, not even when you put incontrovertible evidence in front of their own eyes. We are all waking up to the ugly reality of what we have actually let these Marxists do to our young people. After decades of always being allowed to always have their own way, these malevolent people started going to less and less effort to mask their malignant intentions, eventually dropping all pretext at subtlety. But the tide is starting to turn against them now. People are tired of the lies, tired of the tantrums, tired of keeping quiet, tired of always being the only one who cares about not upsetting others' feelings. And most of all, they're tired of seeing the kind of adults that come from raising children on a diet of lies. They are determined now to reclaim the truth about history and reality and much more. Like the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, all these attacks have managed to do in the end is to, quote, awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve, end quote. One of the people determined to reclaim history is Rafe Heidelmanku. Part of the problem, as he points out, is that only 4% of historians in America are conservatives. The field has been completely captured by the left. Only 1% of professors in the humanities at Harvard are right-leaning. Quote, it's almost impossible to have pure objectivity in history. The best you can hope for is a balance, end quote. But currently in the university system, there is no balance at all. Students used to have professors that were liberal and professors that were conservative. And the contrast between these two schools of thought helped students arrive at their own conclusions. But now they hear only one side of the story with which they are indoctrinated, and there is no other perspective ever even presented to gauge it against. Quote, I think it's fundamentally important because history is one of the key elements that grounds a society and a people to place. It fosters that sense of identity and of belonging and of pride. And if you undermine that, then essentially you sever that connection between people and place. And at a time like today, when you have globalization and you have the threats that we see around us, I think it's fundamentally important that people have a notion of who they are as a people. And also that they are equipped with the knowledge to be able to identify the purveyors of false history, to identify history that they can quite clearly see is a fake or biased. And I'm afraid they simply don't have the necessary skills or knowledge to be able to identify bad history. And that's why we're seeing the perpetuation of all these myths. So it's very easy to hoodwink people about, say, the evils of Winston Churchill. And here I would inject, if you want to know more about Winston Churchill, see my very first episode, Churchill, for a brief historic overview of this truly great man. Continuing with the quote, or Britain's role in slavery, or the exclusively bad side of colonialism. If people simply don't have the knowledge and skill set to be able to rationally evaluate what they're being told. Rafe says that the best sources for history are obviously the original sources. Reading journals, letters, memoirs, autobiographies, direct from the horse's mouth, minus the spin of someone else's commentary, helps you form your own opinions. He also recommends the History Reclaimed website and the works of Andrew Roberts, Niles Ferguson, and Nigel Biggar. Quote, not just to exclusively read that, but read that in the context of what else you've read and what else you've been taught on the left. And I think only by viewing both sides of the argument can you hope to come somewhere near to the accurate record. I personally like anything historical by Dan Jones as well. As Rafe points out, a war has been declared on every single hero that symbolizes the spirit of the West. They've attacked Winston Churchill, Teddy Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Christopher Columbus, and Abraham Lincoln. Virtually every great man in history is on their hit list to discredit, demolish, and erase. And I think he's right that these attacks are really aimed at targeting Britain and America's pride in themselves and all that they have achieved through the heroism of our truly great heroes. There's nothing wrong with teaching the whole truth about these men, including their flaws. But there is something very wrong with teaching only the flaws of some of the most remarkable men who ever lived, while ignoring and downright dismissing their unparalleled contributions to the world. When woke people criticize a historic figure as spectacularly impressive as Henry V for being a misogynist who was living in the year 1400, that argument has all the intelligence of someone criticizing a caveman in the Stone Age for not being a nuclear physicist instead. You have to consider people in the context of the time they lived. Comparing Henry V to someone from 2024 who is living 600 years later in the chain of social evolution is ludicrous. And it is as tedious as it is irritating. I would suggest that these critics are not going to hold up very well either when compared to what people think about their ideas by the year 2650. The question is, was Henry V backwards in his views compared to the other men and women who lived in his time in the year 1400? No. And had any of us been raised in the year 1400, we would have been just as antiquated in our thinking. Minus everything that made him a stunningly impressive figure of history. As Bill Maher joked concerning the left's trend to use presentism when teaching history, quote, which means judging everyone in the past by the standards of the present. It's the belief that people who lived 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago really should have known better, which is so stupid. It's like getting mad at yourself for not knowing what you know now when you were 10. Who doesn't have moments from your past that make you cringe? Who hasn't said, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I wore that. I can't believe I thought that. I can't believe I did that. You ate dirt. You wanted to be a Ghostbuster. You shoplifted gum. You tried to be a white breakdancer. You wanted to marry Scott Baio. I read Ayn Rand. I smoked. I was into numerology. Yes, because we hadn't then grown into the persons that we would become. And humanity writ large is just the collective version of that. Did Columbus commit atrocities? Of course. But people back then were generally atrocious. Everyone who could afford one had a slave, including people of color. The way people talk about slavery these days, you'd think it was a uniquely American thing that we invented in 1619. But slavery throughout history has been the rule, not the exception. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, the Arabs, British, the early Americans, all the way up through R. Kelly. The word slave comes from Slav because so many Slavic people were enslaved. And they're as white as the Hallmark Channel. Who do you think gathered slaves from the interior of Africa to sell to slave traders? Africans, who kept their own slaves. We're a species prone to making others of our species our bitch. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Humans are not good people. And the capacity for cruelty is a human thing, not a white thing. That's the truth, even though it doesn't jive with the current narrative. But in today's world, when truth conflicts with narrative, it's the truth that has to apologize. Being woke is like a magic moral time machine, where you judge everybody against what you imagine you would have done in 1066, and you always win. It's just a way to congratulate yourself on being better than George Washington because you have a gay friend, and he didn't. But if he was alive today, he would too. And if you were alive then, you wouldn't. Portland Public Schools has a plan now to teach kids that the idea of gender being mainly binary was brought here by white colonizers. The curriculum guide says, quote, when the United States was colonized by white settlers, their views around gender were forced upon the people already living here. Not even Star Trek would try that story, where they discover a planet and give them separate bathrooms. It's like they finally discovered a unified theory of wokeness, incorporating all their ideas about race, gay, gender, and colonizers. Like the New World was a great big diverse dance club, and pilgrims were the bridge and tunnel crowd that came in and ruined everything. There's a play called I, Joan currently being presented in London, written by Charlie Josephine, who identifies as non-binary and uses they-them pronouns. And it portrays Joan of Arc as, surprise, non-binary with they-them pronouns. Which, if you think about it, makes even less sense because Joan being French, spoke a language where every noun is masculine or feminine. Joan says in the play, "I'm not a girl. I don't fit that word," as if she's a character on Euphoria. Now, it's true, Joan of Arc did wear pants. But that's what soldiers wore. And she was soldiering. But in the retelling, Joan would rather die than stop wearing men's clothing. Okay, Joan wasn't executed by the fashion police. Her trial went on for over 2 months. We have the transcript. And not once did she complain about being misgendered. She had bigger fish to fry, like herself. Too soon, it was 1431. It's not all up in the air to change or delete or make up based on what makes you feel better today. A couple of years ago, they made a movie called The Aeronauts about the scientists who broke the record for highest altitude in a balloon. In fact, they were both men. But the movie made one of them a woman. Because, as the director explained, representation is important. So true. Women never get enough credit for the things they didn't do. End quote. I would argue that in the field of nonfiction, accuracy is more important than some activist's obsession with perfect representation. There's also this perversely inaccurate idea that only European empires spread and invaded and colonized others, in addition to the idea here that only the United States had slaves. The Ottoman Empire invaded and brutalized its neighbors, expanding all the way into Russia, where they fought for centuries. They took far more slaves from Africa in the trans-Saharan slave trade than the transatlantic slave trade did. They treated slaves with far more brutality too, castrating all of them. And this Islamic slave trade carried on for centuries longer than the European slave trade did, and continued well into the 1900s. Indigenous people in Africa, South America, and the North American Indians conducted brutal tribal warfare against each other on a nearly continual basis. They engaged in kidnapping, rape, slavery, even human sacrifice and cannibalism. How many people know that there were more African slaves held in slavery in Africa by other Africans than all the slaves that were transported across the Atlantic combined? That is a historical fact. It is also a fact that no Europeans ever enslaved free Africans. The European slave traders anchored their ships off the coast of West Africa and went to the slave markets and bought the slaves who had already been enslaved by their fellow Africans. And it was Africans who were the biggest opposition to Britain's attempt to end slavery. All this is a matter of recorded historical fact. So why is only one group of people villainized for their role in all of our ugly history? If these activists really cared as much about colonialism and slavery as they claim to, then they would oppose it in all its forms by anyone who ever engaged in it. Most especially, they would oppose it where it exists today. There are more slaves in the world today than at any other time in human history. Hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. Cameroon has 800,000 slaves. Nigeria, Mali, and Mozambique all still have slaves today. And I have yet to see any of these activists spare a moment to talk about that. The International Labor Organization says 7 out of every 1,000 Africans today is a slave. That would be 10 million people. There were 11 million victims of the entire transatlantic slave trade during all the years it existed combined. Where are the protests for today's slaves? Where are the protests for the millions more enslaved by human traffickers? Why didn't they protest when the Houthis started up slavery again in Yemen? The same activists who make their living as race hustlers by condemning the evils of slavery that existed hundreds of years ago on moral grounds, which I also condemn, never have a word to say about the people engaged in slavery today. If their focus was actually on slavery and its moral evils, their attention would be on condemning those who engage in it today, and on freeing those who are actual victims of it right now, instead of ignoring the present in favor of the past and ignoring the slavers of the modern age, many of which are people of color, in favor of white villains from a bygone era. Clearly, their moral outrage is not very sincere. Not when they care less about the plight of people living in slavery at this very moment than they do about the people who lived in slavery 8 generations ago that we can't help. And what about all these Hamas groupies protesting against the imaginary apartheid in Israel, where Arab citizens do have full rights, their own political party, and currently sit on the Supreme Court? Yet these same activists have nothing to say about the gender apartheid being committed by the terrorists that they idolize so much. Half of the people under this Islamic extremist rule don't even have the right to show their faces. Hundreds of women in Iran have been killed by their own government for protesting these human rights violations committed against them. Yasmin Mohammed was married off to a fundamentalist Muslim who made her wear the full burqa all the time, even at home. He beat her when she took it off once, at home, because there was a window in the apartment. And that was how a Muslim extremist, and I always make that distinction between a regular Muslim and an extremist, treated his wife in Vancouver, Canada. Here's the reality of what it's like to live completely veiled from someone who actually knows. Yasmin, quote, "It just suppresses your humanity entirely. It's like a portable sensory deprivation chamber, and you are no longer connected to humanity. You can't see properly. You can't hear properly. You can't speak properly. People can't see you. You can only see them. Just little things, passing people on the street and just making eye contact and smiling, that's gone. You're no longer part of this world. And so you very quickly just shrivel up into nothing under there." End quote. You want a cause, Gen Z? Because there are plenty of real ones waiting to take the place of your BS ones. 14 countries in the Middle East, plus Gaza, which is not a country, have laws on the books that require women to obey their husbands. They also have guardianship laws. A husband is the legal guardian of his wife. She needs his permission to work, to travel, to leave the house, to go to school, or even to get medical attention. Honor killings, where fathers violently murder their own daughters, are so commonplace that we can't even get an accurate number of how many of them take place. In 59 countries, there are no laws against sexual harassment in the workplace. Many of them also have no laws against domestic violence or spousal rape. 20 of these countries have actual laws that force you to marry your rapist. 30 countries practice female genital mutilation, also known as female circumcision. 650 million women alive today were married off as children. Kind of makes the Jewish people seem pretty reasonable when they say, if you behead my baby and gang rape my daughter to death, I'm going to have to start a war to make sure that everyone with those intentions dies so that they can't do it again, which they keep promising to do up until this very day. And don't come at me with the aid crisis. Israel has shipped in over 1 billion pounds of food into Gaza since the war started. It is not their fault that Hamas steals it. Maybe the people of Gaza should have elected someone to lead them who actually gives a damn about the people. You know, aim for electing leaders who don't deliberately starve their own next time. And if young people want a cause, how about, as Bill Maher suggested, from the river to the sea, every woman shall be free? Or are you just not interested in any cause where the villains don't happen to be white? Sorry to break it to you, kiddos, but sometimes non-white people do bad things too. Maybe we should all drop the hypocrisy and just start opposing bad things, no matter who's doing them. Just a thought. But then, of course, you'd have to side against Hamas after what they did on October 7th. And siding with elderly Holocaust victims just doesn't give you the same vibes of being a revolutionary. So maybe use your voices to encourage the Palestinian people to start making better choices in their government. It's been over 80 years. Israel ain't going anywhere. Jews had been there for 2 millennia when the first foreign Muslims invaded. And there have always been Jews living in the Holy Land at every time in history since then. Some fled for their lives to Europe to escape the regular massacres, and some didn't. Some fled back for their lives because Hitler was building camps. People move. It happens. If you want to argue that Jews can't do that, then I guess your position is that American Indians forfeited their claims when they fled the massacres against them too? Either way, in case you failed to notice, the Jews are a patient and a stubborn people who have been surviving attempts to eradicate them since they were first noticed for existing. They've survived ethnic cleansings in Algeria, Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Syria, Yemen, Tunisia, and more. They've been chased out of Russia, Spain, France, and many neighborhoods in Europe today are no-go zones for Jews. What can I say? They take a licking and keep on ticking. So stop picking on the little guy and pretending it's noble of you to do so. The Palestinians were given their own country too. 2 years before Israel was. It's called Jordan. It's 70% Palestinian to this day, and it is twice the size of Israel. I just solved the Middle East, and all it took was a history book and basic reading comprehension. You can thank me later. Then they were offered a second country in 1947, 1993, 1995, 1998, 2000, and 2008. They were offered 95% of everything they were asking for, nearly the entire West Bank and half of Jerusalem. Every time they walked away without even making a counteroffer and then started a war. Every time. They've had Gaza all to themselves for almost 2 decades, where they elected Hamas, whose own charter says that their purpose is to eradicate all Jews from the entire world. Not a Palestinian state, a genocide. It says it in plain words written by your heroes. You protesters are not helping the Palestinian people by encouraging them to keep up the fight that they've lost for the past 8 decades in a row. If you actually cared about Palestinian kids, then you would encourage their parents to accept reality and try to build a good future for their children through peace and cooperation with their neighbors. Also by electing leaders who don't oppress their own people and steal from them. Maybe build a future where they send their kids to school to learn more than how to use an automatic weapon as they martyr themselves. And one where they use the aid money that is sent to them for something more productive than rocket fire at a peaceful neighbor who helps them more than you or I would in their shoes. Israel has a $500 billion economy. The world's second biggest tech sector after Silicon Valley, and a nuclear arsenal. They're not going anywhere. And they aren't going to allow their children to be routinely slaughtered by people with illusions of returning to a previous century that's over. And they shouldn't have to. Anyone who actually cares about Palestinians should be encouraging them to leave the Stone Age barbarism behind them and move forward productively for a change. They started a war in 1948, in 1967, in 1973, and so on. They've started 5 wars just in this millennia. If they were capable of winning them, then they would have won by now. They aren't. Maybe it's time to consider peace and negotiating in good faith for once. And here's a radical thought. Maybe electing some leaders who can get on board with that concept. Mexico used to own all of Texas, California, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and half of Colorado. We aren't giving that back either. Things change. Mexico had to move on and did. They aren't still waiting for us to give it back and attacking us on a daily basis, because they're not suicidal. History happened. You win some, you lose some. Unless you're the Palestinians, in which case you lose some and then you lose some more. And the reason for that is because they have never once been willing to negotiate, not even to stop deliberately killing innocent civilians. They insist on starting these stupid and deadly wars full of suffering. And if misguided people like these protesters didn't give them false hope and the false belief that the world supports them, instead of just feels bad for the casualties of war, which are 2 different things, then the Palestinians would have moved on a long time ago, like every group of people has had to at some point. The Jews most of all. You're not helping them. And you're not noble. You're getting kids killed. And meanwhile, there are real causes in this world that you aren't interested in. 61 countries impose restrictions on women's clothing. There are 66 countries where being gay is a crime. Burundi's president called on his citizens to stone gay people with rocks, not weed. Hamas throws gay people from rooftops to their deaths, you hypocritical queer protesters. Uganda has the death penalty for being found guilty of the crime of being gay. China has the death penalty for nearly 50 crimes, including stealing, rioting, and destroying a vehicle. In 13 countries, atheism is punishable by death. In Russia, referring to the war in Ukraine as a war can get you 15 years in a prison in sunny Siberia. Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Sudan still cut the hands off of thieves. So I don't recommend looting there if you do decide to protest something worthy for a change. Because unlike in California, the first grand of your theft isn't free. And before any of you do decide to arrange protests in any of these places, just know that many of them also shoot protesters, even peaceful ones. And I don't mean fake peaceful like the mostly peaceful BLM riots. I mean even if you're actually really peaceful. So I'd protest from a distance. Look, did the British Empire and the United States do some bad things at certain points in history? Of course they did. No one disputes that, including me. That side of the story has been told relentlessly. The part that is not being told today is all the good they have done for the entire world, or how little harm they did compared to the alternatives of their time. All that people want is for the whole story to be told. No one wants to edit out the bad stuff. But we have had enough of the bad actors' creative editing too. Let's just teach it all. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Of all peoples. And all places. Rafe pointed out on trigonometry that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the pieces of its empire, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, all fled to join the West, to join the EU and NATO. By contrast, when Britain gave independence to its colonies, they chose voluntarily to continue their association under the Commonwealth. And during World War II, Britain's former colonies rushed to her defense from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, even in India, who raised the largest volunteer army in history, despite having the best case of any of the groups not to. As Rafe said, quote, "That's not something you do when you are under the yoke of an evil empire." Even Pakistan and India did not overthrow the structures and institutions that the British Empire had set up. They simply wanted to run and govern those structures and institutions themselves. Quote, "And wherever you go in the world, and whatever region of the world you go to, those countries that were former British colonies are the ones that are most likely to be wealthy, stable, and democratic. In fact, it's the legacy of the British Empire that has enabled many of these colonies to become global players. The English language, the common law, the infrastructure of the civil service, of the military, of the police, the hospitals that were built there by the British. There are so many good things that were done by colonialism. I often say that colonialism and capitalism, for all their ills, nothing has done more to lift the world out of poverty than colonialism and capitalism. And that's something you can't say today, but that's the reality." End quote. History, like life itself, has good and bad, positive aspects and negative ones. Why does that have to be so controversial? Why can't we just be rational and factual in our approach to history? Rafe argues that the strange circumstances of the present day has made it where the counterculture, the new revolutionaries, are people who just want balance and a reasonable dose of sanity. Quote, "You don't need to fly red flags from rooftops to have a revolution and have mobs in the street. We've had this long march through the institutions. The buildings still stand there, but the people who inhabit them are cuckoos in the nest, who bear no comparison or connection to the generations who built those institutions." So we have this inverted or subverted ideology now, which views any presence of Britain, and I would argue of America as well, or even the West as a whole, around the world as being necessarily evil, because it advances what I would regard as a Marxist agenda. I call woke American Marxism. And Britain has succumbed to this American woke mind virus, which I think is a virus transmitted by the English language, which is why it's more present in the Anglosphere and in Scandinavia, which of course they're all bilingual there, and in the Netherlands. End quote. Slavery was a universal evil. It was practiced by all races, all religions, all empires, throughout all of humanity's history. Not only did all groups practice it, but all groups were victims of it at one time or another. According to Rafe, what was unique to Britain was the evangelical Christian movement, which caused Britain to uniquely reject the concept of slavery, which has always been a given, and to spend the second half of its history atoning for the sins of its first half. It spent the equivalent of 2% of its GDP on the West Africa Squadron, which was the Royal Navy enforcing its shutdown of the slave trade on the Atlantic Ocean. Quote, now, I don't think there was ever before a case of a country deliberately making itself poorer in order to advance a moral objective for the greater good. And I think that's something that everybody in Britain should be hugely and supremely proud of, end quote. What actually makes Britain and America unique is not that we owned slaves at one point, because that is true of every people and every nation. What makes us different is that we voluntarily stopped on moral grounds, which can't be said of everybody. Even though everyone else was doing it, and it made them poorer to give it up, Britain and the U.S. voluntarily stopped. And then Britain went the extra mile to voluntarily impoverish itself further to stop other people from continuing the slave trade. And here in America, people marched to die on battlefields for complete strangers, leaving their families to sacrifice in poverty in order to end the evil that is slavery. That is what makes us different from everybody else. Not slavery, that is what makes the West exceptional. That is the genius on which we were founded. Rafe explained that Westerners actually view the world differently than other cultures do. Most of our problems when it comes to foreign affairs stems from the fact that we fail to recognize that the rest of the world does not think like Westerners do. Joseph Heinrich wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Regular and Particularly Preposterous. Weird, in his title, stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Developed. He discusses how Westerners are bad at facial recognition compared to other cultures because we only use the right side of our brain for facial recognition, whereas non-Westerners use both the left and the right side of the brain for that. There are differences between Westerners and non-Westerners when it comes to memory, attention, spatial awareness, and visual reasoning too. Joseph Heinrich claims that these differences go back 1,000 years to when the Catholic Church in the West banned cousin marriages. Up until then, people married within their clans, which consisted of their extended families. So most marriages were between second, third, or fourth cousins. As a result of these reinforced family ties, clan societies have a lot of nepotism, conformity, and obedience to their leaders. When cousin marriages were banned, the nuclear family was born, which doesn't exist elsewhere in the world. 90% of the world doesn't have the concept of the exclusive nuclear family that we do. 75% of the world still has cousin marriages. We're the outliers. Once the nuclear family existed as a separate entity from the clan, the concept of individuality emerged. And since these nuclear families had to interact with each other and didn't have clans to depend on, it forced them to negotiate with strangers. So you also had a rise in innovation. This caused one of the West's defining features to be higher levels of social trust and faith in our fellow neighbors, which is not shared by non-Western cultures. Since these nuclear families had to rely on each other for help and services, people began making their own choices of occupation for the first time ever. Prior to that, you would have been born into the profession of your family or clan, and you would have had no choice about it. It wouldn't have even occurred to you that there was an alternative. As different individuals with different occupations began trading services, the concept of contracts was born. From this came the birth of guilds, fraternities, trade unions, universities, and charter towns where you had to apply to join the town and take an oath to fulfill certain responsibilities to help the town develop. All of these things were unique to Western culture. Innovation was born out of all the cross-pollination of these institutions built around individualism, rather than people spending their entire life in one location among the same group of people centered around their clan's identity. Rafe asserts that social trust is intrinsically linked to economic prosperity and innovation. It was on the foundation of these building blocks that the unique mindset of the West grew. Guilt, for example, is a concept that came from the West. When we do something bad, we feel guilty because we have let ourselves down, failing as individuals to live up to our own moral code. Elsewhere in the world, that feeling would be replaced by shame, a feeling that one has dishonored their family. Another example would be that when you ask a Westerner to describe themselves, they list achievements and attributes. They would list their profession, perhaps a hobby or interest, and maybe a facet of their personality, like being an introvert. If you were to ask someone from a non-Western culture, such as in an African tribe, the same question, they would describe themselves in the context of the tribe and family connections. They are the son of A, the husband of B, and the father of C. Protestantism could only have happened in the West, where we already valued the individual. Protestantism gave birth to mass literacy through the idea that an intermediary priest was not necessary and that the individual could and should read the Word of God for himself. And it was Protestantism and the resulting surge in literacy that gave rise to concepts such as liberty and human rights, the innovation of which produced the Industrial Revolution. Another great lie of the modern age is that it was slavery that produced the Industrial Revolution. If that was true, it would have taken place in Spain and Portugal, not in Britain. Spain had 1/3 more slaves than Britain did. Not only is it not where the Industrial Revolution happened, but these countries became economically insignificant by comparison. This is true in America as well. It was the non-slave-owning North that industrialized, while the South fell behind the times and continued to rely on slave labor. Rafe attributes lies like these to the incessant need to always lay the cause for any achievement by the West at the feet of something bad in order to dismiss all its accomplishments. They argue that the West didn't succeed because of the genius of its founders, who flourished under the genius system which they created of a democracy that valued individual rights. No, the West only succeeded because it took advantage of others and used slave labor. It has its success and wealth because of its sinister deeds. If that were actually true, then why aren't the countries that still use slave labor today, the most prosperous in the world, instead of the most impoverished. They should be destroying us economically because of all of the advantages of their victimized labor force. Slave labor actually had nothing to do with why we became what we became. If anything, it was our unique decision to stop slave labor here that was the reason that we became what we became. Rafe doesn't deny the horrors of slavery, and neither do I. If reparations had been available in 1860, then the people who had actually been enslaved would absolutely have every right to claim them. But 8 generations later, when Black Americans are the richest Africans on the face of the earth, that is a fact, boys and girls. It's easy to compare the incomes of different groups. And this is what those comparisons show. Reparations came from the concept of tort law, which says that a victim has the right to be made whole again, as though the bad thing had never happened to them. But you can't make the argument that African Americans are worse off and should be made whole again, because the evidence doesn't support that. If slavery had never happened to their ancestors, then they would have been born in Africa, where they would be poorer than they are now. So how do you make that whole, which is what tort law is designed to do? The complicated reality is that while their ancestors did pay a terrible price, and I don't say this part with a lack of sensitivity, but their descendants are the ones who benefited the most from that atrocity. Even a civil rights activist like Muhammad Ali acknowledged after visiting Africa that he was glad that his granddaddy was put on that ship. History is complicated. 2 things can be true at once. Slavery was an atrocity that caused a lot of human suffering. The people who owned slaves benefited from that human suffering. And so did the descendants of those slaves, who would have otherwise been born in Africa, living in abject poverty. The same holds true for the descendants of British slaves in the Caribbean. If you compare black people in the Caribbean to black people in West Africa, where their ancestors came from, the income of black people in the Caribbean is over 10 times higher. And they live 17 years longer, almost 2 decades more of life. It's true that slavery was horrific, and Jim Crow was horribly unjust. And it obviously did hold African Americans back. But if the argument is that they would have been better off had the wrong never been done, if their ancestors had been left in Africa and slavery had never happened, and as a result, they ended up worse off and deserved to be made whole again, which is what a reparation claim would legally require, then that's a case that activists are going to have to prove with all the evidence out there to the contrary. So, good luck with that. But they can't make the argument that their ancestors should not have been brought over as slaves and then argue that they should be compensated for the evils of that slavery for a loss that by today's numbers was really a financial gain. Especially when they went through none of the hardships and inherited all of the benefits. And especially not when Jews and Poles never received compensation for Auschwitz and the total loss of their wealth and businesses and loved ones. And that happened only 3 or 4 generations ago at most, not 8. Bad things happened to everyone's ancestors. And America did do some bad things to multiple groups of people. Quote, The healthy view is to accept it and acknowledge it fully, but also to put it into context of what was going on at the time. Again, don't judge the past by today's standards. Atrocities are always atrocities, but in terms of attitudes and so forth, those must always be taken within the context of the time. The evils of slavery were horrendous for the time, but I don't think we can say that the legacy of that today is such a bad thing, especially when you consider the wealth in the Caribbean, the wealth of America, and the wealth of black people living in this country compared to what it was in Africa. Look, no one is trying to put anything under the carpet. We must always expose. But the problem is we have too much focus on the negative and not enough focus on the good things that were done, end quote. Rafe went on to explain how in India the British stopped the burning of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres and allowed them to remarry. They also passed legislation to stop the infanticide of young girls. They stopped the headhunting trade in New Zealand. They tried to end female genital mutilation in East Africa. In the kingdom of Benin and Dahomey, the human sacrifice of slaves by the thousands was an annual event. And in places like Mali and Mozambique, the atrocities of witchcraft-related human sacrifice still continue to this day. When America was founded, it was the only pure democratic republic on earth. By the end of the Civil War, just 90 years later, there were 5 others. Now there are around 190 democracies modeled on us and Britain. And no one should be more aware of the good done by the West than women. Everywhere that was colonized by the West saw a rise in women's rights and their equality before the law. Also, the fact that a quarter of the globe has democratic legislatures is something that they owe to Western influence that came to them through colonization. Colonization brought some very bad things, but it brought some good things too. Why is it wrong to be honest about that? Life is messy. It isn't all black and white. But no one wants to even acknowledge the good things as part of the conversation. They claim that doing that is excusing the wrongdoing in some way. It's not. Nothing could excuse slavery. So there's no need to lie as though the truth risks doing that. We are seeing a deliberate effort to erase the good from history, erase the heroes from history, and not only teach the bad, which we should do, but to focus solely on it, and in some instances even lie to make it worse than it was, as though the truth isn't brutal enough. Quote, "None of this is based on a genuine quest for truth or justice. None of the campaigners for BLM and elsewhere care about slavery. If they did, they'd be campaigning about modern slavery. This is all about trying to undermine the West and its achievements," end quote. This is why these activists will condemn a great man like Winston Churchill for being a racist, who, despite writing more words than Shakespeare and Dickens combined, never used the N-word and rarely used any racial epithets. But they have no criticism for Karl Marx, who used the N-word in almost every letter he ever wrote. The glaring holes in this ideology is something that mainly only the young fail to notice, because when you're young, you want to be part of something bigger and more extreme, which makes it easy to radicalize them. That is why Hitler created Hitler's Youth. It's why the old adage has survived: if you're not a liberal at 25, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at 35, you have no brain. The unfortunate reality is that we live in a world where Marxists come in a variety of stripes. Just like there are many kinds of big cats in Africa, lions, leopards, cheetahs, there are many different kinds of Marxists. Traditional economic Marxism attacks capitalism and private property. But the same oppressor-oppressed ideology has been applied to other stripes of Marxism as well. Critical race theory uses this oppressor-oppressed framework to attack white people who they label as oppressors. The newest and most radical form of feminism uses the same dynamic to attack men, whom they label as the patriarchy oppressors. We also have queer theory, which makes straight people the oppressors of the LGBTQ and seeks to dismantle family structures. Then you have those preaching post-colonialism and decolonization who seek to attack everything that the West achieved. But these ideologies are all linked by intersectionality, and all of the demoralizing destruction of these various species of Marxists combined has wreaked a lot of havoc on our society. There were a few people preaching these extreme views in the 70s, but they were definitely the fringe radicals accepted only by the underground. And the present devotees of this new religion, which most of its adherents don't even know is communism by another name, they are still very much the fringe minority. Through the tyranny of their bullying, they managed to silence everyone else for a while, which allowed their ideas to become mainstreamed. But the pushback has begun, and it's gaining incredible momentum quickly. When communism fell in the Soviet half of Europe, you immediately saw those countries restore their nation's flags, their national anthems, all the symbols of their nation's identity that had been undermined when communism rewrote their histories. We're seeing that same spirit of a proud people finally standing up here in the United States as well. Quote, artificially constructed ideologies rarely last because they don't have secure foundations. It took 70 years or whatever for communism to finally collapse. Who knows how long it will take in this country? But there are enough of us now speaking out against this and trying to subvert the subverted. But hopefully, it won't be that long. End quote. And I don't think it will be. I think we are very close to completely killing off these bad ideas in the next few years if we don't sabotage ourselves and screw it up. Immigration, uncoupled from assimilation, is a problem that Britain may not be able to overcome. They've had more immigration in the past 25 years than they had in the last 2,000 years combined, and it has drastically changed what Britain is. As anyone who keeps up with what's been going on over there during the last few years already knows. Their complete absence of any insistence that immigrants integrate has resulted in a fractured society that lives in pockets, where the children and grandchildren of Muslim immigrants are even more radical than their parents. 1/3 of them, between the ages of 16 and 24, believe that you should be put to death for apostasy. Only 5% don't think that homosexuality should be illegal. 62% believe in restricting free speech. The majority believe that it should be illegal to show a picture of Muhammad. As Rafe points out, why would these kids growing up in isolated ghetto communities want to integrate into a society that they are always being told is awful? Especially when minority cultures have been elevated over British culture to the highest positions in British society, while the Western world prioritizes affirming everyone's individual traits as the pinnacle of human existence. And this is a problem with Islamic immigrants specifically when it comes to Britain. I know that's unpopular to say, but we've reached a point where the truth has to start being said anyway. Muslims are twice as likely to become extremists if they live in isolated communities, which serve as petri dishes for abhorrent practices like honor killings, child marriages, arranged marriages, and the rape gangs that have terrorized Britain. Britain now leads the world in the number of acid attacks. Those of us who have been listening to Douglas Murray for years have not been surprised by what we've been seeing in Europe lately. The Danes have taken a different approach to the same problem. Although clearly after the highly coordinated anti-Semitic planned pogrom that we witnessed recently in Amsterdam, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done in the Netherlands as a whole. The Danes have deconstructed these isolated pockets through laws that say that no more than 30% of any one community can be made up of ethnic minorities, so that immigrants will live in a mostly Danish culture and absorb Danish values. After all, that's what they immigrated there for, right? Each school can only have a maximum of 30% ethnic minorities. Ethnic minorities born in these pockets in Denmark have to undergo 30 hours a week of Danish childcare so that they can learn the Danish language, etc. That may sound extreme to us in America, but that actually demonstrates the scale and the severity of the problems in Europe, where Jews cannot go into certain districts of their own hometowns anymore. And many are fleeing the UK altogether after living there for generations, because even their little girls are ending up in the hospital after having things thrown at them in the streets just for being Jewish. There are schools in the north of England where English children are growing up believing that England is actually a mostly Asian country, because that's all they know. By 2066, white Brits will be an ethnic minority in their own country. And that statistic was based on immigration rates that were half of what they currently are. When immigration is allowed to be that overwhelming and indiscriminate, there is no opportunity for integration and no hope for any kind of assimilation that will maintain most of the host country's original cultural identity. Here in America, the conservative estimate is that we have 12 million people here illegally right now. That's equal to the entire population of 11 states: Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, Rhode Island, Montana, Maine, New Hampshire, and Hawaii combined. And that's the conservative estimate. But that is about to be dealt with, and I don't think the American people are going to balk the way that activists hope they will. So if you're banking on that in the sanctuary states, prepare for disappointment. I think the overwhelming majority of the people want this. We've seen the threat by looking at Europe, and also by what we've seen here over the last 4 years, especially in your states. We want immigration, but we want it to be legal, where we decide exactly who we're letting in. As Francis Foster said, quote, "What we're talking about here really is the obliteration of a culture. If you don't have a homogeneous culture, then you don't have a society." Rafe agreed. Quote, "Precisely. That is the long march through the institutions. It's all about using minorities, be they ethnic minorities, be they gay, be they women, be they trans, using minorities to advance the agenda in a way that the working class never did. Because the working class ended up being small c conservatives, the same types who voted in the Red Wall for Boris Johnson, patriots who leaned left on economics. Whenever I talk about immigration, people say, oh, well, how can you, of all people, be opposed to all of this? And I will say, look, there's a difference between mass immigration and immigration. What we had in the 80s and 90s was 50,000 a year. And we had iconic British role models who were black or Asian. You had Daley Thompson, Sir Linford Christie. You had Freddie Mercury. Nobody saw them through the prism of race. They were all British. Now everything we're seeing is through the prism of race, and that's been the most destructive aspect of what we're seeing right now in our society. And the greatest tragedy of the last 14 years is that we've had a conservative government in place who could have reversed that long march through the institutions, because Tony Blair had 13 years in which he was able to unfurl his plan for restructuring and changing the face of Britain. And remember, mass immigration started under Tony Blair. And part of the reason we know was to rub the right's nose in diversity, because 80% of ethnic minorities tend to vote for the Labor Party. The idea of New Labor was to flood the nation with a new voting demographic who would ensure that in decades to come, they would be in charge. And if you look at London and Birmingham, these are essentially one-party states. The great tragedy is that conservatives put the pedal to the metal. They just continued and accelerated all of that. And we now have a Labor government in place right now, which is simply going to continue. I don't think you're going to see any dramatic decline in immigration. And unless that is taken control of, I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the greater struggle of Britain. I do think that in terms of wokery and the education system, I do think there is a way that we can actually see a light at the end of the tunnel. Because of the fact that you've got a lot of socially conservative people coming in who are going to reject a lot of the values which are being spouted. That's why I think there's a bit of a hope on that side. But demographics absolutely is the greatest challenge of our day, end quote. One of the greatest crimes of this woke capture is that historians, who are supposed to be the custodians of the truth about the past, above all else, have both allowed this takeover and the spread of these lies unopposed. Quote, that's been the greatest tragedy in my view personally, in terms of my profession, is to see ideology trump objective truth and the scientific method in history. And the reason for it is quite clear. The left has always been better at capturing the levers of power. So in academic terms, that means the bureaucracy and the administration. So the left have been able to get themselves into the heads of departments, chairing committees, and much as you see in the BBC, there's an element of unconscious bias in the hiring practices, but also deliberate efforts made to ensure that when conservative historians or more objective historians retire, that they're not replaced with like-minded people. And it's not just in university. It's in the secondary schools as well. We see the same thing happening where you have 90% of teachers voting for left-wing parties. When I was at school, you had a number of extremely right-wing teachers. Some of them had just come out of the war as well. So old war types, and they were the guys who would throw the chalk dust at you and so forth. They've all gone. The publishing industry is very different now as well. You simply can't get books published by traditional mainstream university academic publishers. And historians tend to use academic publishers for many of their works. And they're simply getting rejected. And of course, career progression. If you want to get ahead in the university foundations, you need to keep your head down, because you're not going to get those promotions and you're not going to get tenure necessarily. There is no hope for any chance of saving this nation, or at least restoring it to some sort of balance, if we don't tackle the teaching profession. You can change the curriculum as many times as you want to, but if you don't actually change the cadre and the type of person that's teaching, there is no hope, because children learn by osmosis. And tackling universities is fine. There's too much focus on about universities. We need to tackle primary schools and so forth. As I say, if the hair is blue, there's nothing you can do. You need to go for the younger generation. Aristotle said, "Give me a boy of 7 and I will show you the man." We need to understand that it's children who are being indoctrinated at a very young age. We need to have channels for teachers to come in from other areas. There used to be a program, Troops for Teachers. Getting soldiers to come into the teaching profession, getting people from the corporate world. And by that means, you'll be able to introduce more balance into the teaching profession. We don't want to have a right-wing teaching profession. We simply want balance. End quote. One piece of good news is that AI learning is the future and won't be subject to the ideologies of individual teachers. But that is yet another reason why we have to protect AI from the religious zealots who care more about their Marxist religion than they do about the truth. They cannot be allowed to corrupt AI the way they have clearly been trying to. We need to keep a very watchful eye on that area as it continues to develop and be ready to fight, if need be, for that balance. We can't afford to keep sacrificing higher values in order to not ruffle prissy feathers anymore. Here in the United States, the push to reclaim ourselves has already begun. We must reclaim our history and our pride and our optimism. And most of all, we must fight to the death to reclaim the truth from those who would mangle it for the sake of their own preferred narratives. The pushback against all of this is big, and it is growing, but it didn't end with one election. Now the real work begins. We won't always agree with each other on every detail, and we don't have to. That's what debate is for. Embrace that. And may the best ideas for the brightest future win. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast, and I hope you come back next week. If you want to hear my thoughts on a couple of headlines, I do have that coming up. To give an example of some of the things we've been talking about today, and also to put a little bit of the truth that needs to start being said out there, I'm going to play a clip of Jasmine Crockett, who's a Congress member. She's technically a part of the squad, but she's the B team. Despite 2 vacancies as squad members have been voted out of Congress, they still won't move Jasmine up to varsity. She just can't get the cool kids to like her. And by the cool kids, I mean the kids sitting in the corner of the chambers of Congress eating their own hair. Unfortunately for Jasmine, she must have been dropped on her head as a baby because her highest aspiration is to be a low IQ anti-Semite like Rashida Tlaib. And she can't quite even make that bar. I mean, if your highest aspiration in life is to be a member of the squad, the stupidity quest under aggressive destruction, those notorious loser idiots, then there's probably no hope for you. And Jasmine takes every chance she gets to prove that. So here's what she had to say.
But you consistently said over and over the word oppression, and every time that you said it, it was almost as if I was hearing nails on a chalkboard, because it seems like you don't understand the definition of oppression, and I'd ask you to just refer to Google to help you out. Oppression is the prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control. That is the definition of oppression. And so as I sit here as a black woman who practiced civil rights, let me tell you the reason that my colleagues wanted to make sure you understood the same black history that your side of the aisle wants to delete out of classrooms is because you can then misuse words like oppression. There has been no oppression for the white man in this country.
Oh, really?
You tell me which white men were dragged out of their homes.
All right, I'm going to interject here. She's arguing that DEI practices, meaning affirmative action, which has already been thrown out by the Supreme Court, should be allowed to continue. These policies discriminate against people on the basis of their race in order to favor other races whose ancestors were discriminated against at some point in the past. Jasmine is defending the idea that this present discrimination should be left in place. I'll just point out for the record that I can attest from personal experience, from having listened to multiple clips from Jasmine over the years, that the sensation she describes of nails on a chalkboard when having to listen to certain people speak is something experienced on all sides of the aisle, sweetheart. Number 2, if you're looking for definitions, aim higher than Google. Because Google's definitions are a joke that have all been rewritten in order to make words mean what activists like you want them to mean instead of what they actually mean. So go back to the original Webster's Dictionary, one from 1990 or earlier, and then we'll talk. That is, if the words in there don't have too many syllables for you to understand. You then asked us to name white people who have been oppressed. My ancestors, for one. Sicilians, when they came over here, were told that they need not apply for jobs. They were labeled as some undesirable second-class version of Italians based on the darkness of their skin at Ellis Island. They were told they could not worship with the rest of the congregation in Catholic churches. They had to go down to the basement. And, by the way, the largest mass lynching in American history was not of black people like you, hun. It was of Sicilian Americans like me. Try reading a history book for once in your life, sweetheart. Maybe that should start being a basic prerequisite for being fit to serve in Congress. Continuing with her idiocy.
Tell me which one of them got dragged all the way across an ocean and told that you are going to go at work.
Indentured servants, that's who. Scottish people, also my ancestors. People from all across Europe, as indentured servants, were separated from their families, dragged against their will across an ocean in those tubs of diseases, and then put into chains and forced to work. That's who, hun. Once again, try reading a history book before you spout off your self-impressed bullshit.
We are going to steal your wives. We are going to rape your wives. That didn't happen. That is oppression.
Yes, it did.
We didn't ask to be here.
Okay, so now we're resorting to a teenager's "I didn't ask to be born" stupidity argument. Okay, Jasmine, other than first-generation immigrants, which of us did ask to be here? People all over the world, people like me, and people like you, were born wherever we happen to be born. Now, most of us have the basic intelligence that you lack to know that in our case, that's a good thing. We got the luck of the draw. We were born in the freest, most wealthy, safest, and even diverse and accepting country in the world. Now, the fact that you lack the intelligence to be able to appreciate that is your problem. I tend not to resort to the argument of if you don't like it, then go back where you came from, because I don't like it, and I think it's ugly. But the childish, unintelligent arguments you're making actually deserve that in response. The only people who ask to be here are first-generation immigrants, okay? And as we discussed earlier, black people in the United States are the wealthiest black people on the face of the planet. That is just an economic fact. Plus, we are one of very few places that even care about injustices between different groups. Maybe you don't realize how rare that actually is, but those of us with functioning brains do. So, just like Muhammad Ali, who also fought for civil rights, sweetheart, and I don't agree with everything he ever said, but obviously I agree that Jim Crow was a terrible thing. Slavery was a terrible thing. But even somebody in his position who lived in an era where he still actually faced a lot of injustice, unlike you, when he did the rumble in the jungle and actually went to Africa and they asked him what he thought about it, even his response, because he was not absolutely brain dead like you are, was, "I am so glad my great-granddaddy was put on that ship." Because that's reality, hun. The truth is a complicated, harsh thing. Was it great for his great-granddaddy? Hell no! It was awful! Did other people benefit from the awful thing that happened to him? Yes! And one of them was you! The people who owned slaves benefited from it. And so did you, because it allowed you to be born here instead of in some African country with polluted drinking water and outdoor outhouses, sweetheart. If you doubt that, then go try living in that reality, and we'll see if even your low IQ can manage to hang on to your delusions when confronted with that particular reality. Now, as far as the point you were trying to make, that present discrimination is the remedy for past discrimination, I'm going to have to point out a very basic reality for you. There is no one of any race on this planet whose ancestors were not somebody else's slaves. You are not special. You are not the only one. The Brits were enslaved by the Romans. Europeans were enslaved by the Barbary pirates in Africa. While the transatlantic slave trade was taking 11 million Africans from their homeland, Muslims in the Ottoman Empire took 18 million of them and not only enslaved them, but castrated them too. Asians had slaves. Native Americans enslaved each other. Africans enslaved each other. Everybody on this planet was at one point someone else's slave. And at another point, the owner of slaves. That's just the ugly reality of humanity's history. Singling out white people as the only people who did that to others is just plain inaccurate. In fact, if you want to know what actually makes white people different, we're the only race who voluntarily gave it up. It was profitable for us to keep slaves, just like it was profitable for everyone else who did it, including Africans, who are the ones who sold each other into slavery. So we have no way of knowing that your ancestors were slaves as opposed to one of the Africans who went and kidnapped other Africans in the middle of the night and sold them to the white slave traders in exchange for trinkets like mirrors. Yeah, I ain't diluting the truth for you today, hon, because I'm fed up. We've all stayed silent in order to be polite and let you and people like you have your dumb say because it made you feel better to do so, but we're done. So get ready for some 150 proof truth today, because I ain't diluting it down with compassion. Not today. White people were the only ones who said, you know what? Even though everyone else is doing it, and has been doing it for all of human history, and they all want to continue doing it, and it would be profitable for us to continue doing it too, this is actually immoral. And we're going to voluntarily give it up to our own financial detriment. Then we're even going to go the extra mile and invest more of our own money in order to stop other people from doing it, the way the British did to end the transatlantic slave trade. And then as Americans, we went out there and fought on battlefields and died for people we had never met down south, leaving our own children orphans and our own wives widows to die in poverty in order to end that evil. That's what white people did that was different from everybody else, sweetheart. So this idea that because your great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy had something truly terrible happen to him, that's the same as if that terrible thing had happened to you and gives you the right to do terrible things to other people, doesn't hold water. Because my great-great-granddaddy, who's a hell of a lot closer to me in the timeline than your ancestors are to you, when he came here, he had to carry a gun around in Mississippi while he worked in the fields because that was the only job he could get. And he had to carry the gun everywhere he went because of the hatred against Sicilian Americans by people who believed that they were all part of the mafia was so great that he could be lynched at any time. That's reality, sweetheart. That is reality. Everybody's ancestors had a pretty crappy time of life. And the people you want to discriminate against at colleges in order to make you feel better, their ancestors were treated badly too. Asian people have faced plenty of discrimination, and you want to continue to discriminate against them. Jews typically have pretty good rates of getting into Ivy League schools based on their merit, not based on somebody with a bad idea saying, yeah, you aren't qualified, but we're going to give you an extra spin like you're still in some toddler game of Candyland because they pity you. and feel guilty about the bad thing that happened to your great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy. Those Jews whose family members died in the Holocaust, 1/3 of the entire world's population of Jews went up in smoke in that massacre, which only someone as low IQ as you would be dumb enough to even try to argue was not 1,000 times worse than slavery was, and a hell of a lot closer in history than slavery was, and was one of only a list of things. The Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, all kinds of pogroms that have been conducted throughout all of history, going back to Egyptian slavery, all atrocities that have happened against the Jews, as opposed to the one period in history that your people were discriminated against. You want to talk about prolonged, cruel, and unjust treatment? No one beats the Jews at that game. Their treatment has been the most cruel in history, and consistently so, over incredibly prolonged periods of time, and they bitch about it a hell of a lot less than you do. Which is my theory about why people like you don't like them all that much. They make you look really bad. Because they've overcome way more than you have, been treated way worse than you have, complained less than you have, and succeeded more than pretty much anyone else on the face of the planet. Put that in your squad pipe and smoke it. Like I said, I ain't diluting this. This is the 150 proof version of truth, and you can choke on it. So no, we are not going to let you continue to discriminate against these people, even if it makes you feel bad. I know that messes with your life ambition to become a part of the low IQ anti-Semite squad, but that's just too bad. You have a very sad aspiration for your life. But the American people are done with this shit. We're done with the faux intellectual vomit of people like you. And we are going to start calling it out, rather than always being nice. For my whole life, I've kept quiet and not said the things that needed to be said, or diluted it all down with all kinds of qualifiers and niceties to try to make it more palatable while still speaking at least a little bit of the truth. I've been a pushover and a coward. And even though I still highly value kindness, for someone like you, right now, no. It's time for some straight Jane stuff. My first loyalty from now on is to the truth, so get ready. People are fed up with you. They're fed up with you, and they're fed up with your intellectual rot. They're fed up with letting their children grow up believing these lies because no one is willing to say the truth. And we are going to start reclaiming history and teaching all of it. So get ready. We are going back to a world where all men are created equal, and each individual is judged on the content of his character, not on the color of his skin, either for or against him. And I understand why that prospect doesn't appeal to you very much, because by that measurement, you fail miserably. But that's your problem from now on. And I would just point out a little irony to you, Jasmine, which is that slavery would never have ended if it had been left up to people like you, who are too selfish to give up what is benefiting them, i.e. the discrimination that you want to keep in place, because it benefits you, even though it hurts other people. That was the justification for keeping slaves in the first place. Chew on that. Unfortunately, she won't, because she is just not able to stop the flow of stupid coming out of her mouth. Here is Jasmine's latest clip, arguing that somehow people of color aren't being represented in the state of Texas, where they have moved to get away from crazy fringe leftists like her. Here's what she had to say about that.
We know that specifically Texas added 4 million people. Of those 4 million people, do you want to take a guess at how many were Anglos? Just a guess.
I'd say a majority.
180,000. That's it, of 4 million. 95% of the people that were added, and we know that when it comes to minority populations, they tend to be undercounted. So get this. We added 4 million people. They were people of color. Texas got 2 new seats. So they took those black and brown and Asian bodies, and guess what? Do you think that we got a new black, brown, or Asian seat? Somehow, the way that they do their Republican math in the state of Texas, that amounted to 2 new white seats. Guess what? White Republican seats. We got 2 new Republican seats out of 4 million people of color. So let me tell you, they love to use our bodies to apportion us in an inaccurate way.
Okay, Jasmine, the math problem is yours, not the people counting the population. Your math is that all people of color choose who they vote for, with their highest priority being someone whose skin tone is similar to theirs. Guess what? A lot of people of color do not think like you. They want someone who is going to enact the legislation that they want, who is going to create the policies they want, who is going to represent their values and make their lives better. And if that person happens to have the same tint to their skin as they do, fine. If they don't, fine. If they happen to be the same gender as them, fine. If they don't, fine. Most people have bigger priorities than judging the color of someone's skin. And who they choose to represent them is not based on whose skin looks most like theirs. It's on who shares the same values and is heading in the same direction. Most people are just more mature than you, Jasmine. Look, I don't know who in their right mind voted this airhead into office, but you should be humiliated at being represented by somebody this stupid. I mean, absolutely devastatingly humiliated. I also wanted to comment very, very briefly on 3 major stories going on right now. Because I had previously said that I was excited about and fully supported Donald Trump's nomination of Pete Hegseth to take over the military and run the Department of Defense. And there have been a lot of allegations being thrown at him lately, so I felt like I needed to clarify whether I still support him or not. And the answer to that is yes. At this point, I still fully support him. Do I know what happened between him and the woman in the hotel? No, I don't. I was not there. I would never want to disbelieve somebody who actually had something that horrible happen to them. But here's the thing. Because I was not there, I have to judge the credibility of the 2 people involved. And Pete Hegseth is a veteran who served his country and won 2 Bronze Stars. It is his word against a woman who, first of all, is remaining anonymous, so she's not willing to attach her identity to her story. There may be reasons for that, but nevertheless, that is the situation. And who is of the moral fiber that she not only was comfortable cheating, but was comfortable cheating under the same roof as her husband and children, who had made accusations like this before that were not found credible in either case. So it's her word, a story which she only came up with 4 days later, and only because her husband wanted to know where she had been all night in the hotel that they were staying at together with their children. And only then did this story emerge with no evidence behind it. And all the witnesses to their interaction at the bar said she was the aggressor. She was the one egging the whole thing on. She has made these accusations before, and in other instances, they were not found credible either. Do I know what happened? No. Could something bad have happened to someone who is not credible? Of course it could. But I have to go based on My best guess, because I wasn't there. And if you're asking me to remove a Bronze Star veteran who is going to do a good job on the word of somebody with no credibility, who is remaining anonymous, who was not found credible by the police, who was contradicted by the witnesses, and I'm supposed to weigh that in the balance and find that to count for more than Pete Hegseth's life serving in the military? I'm sorry, but no, that doesn't outweigh it. All the other accusations that have been made against him are also anonymous, not very credible, and I have to weigh these rumors, because that's all they are, as anonymous complaints, against the people who are coming out in Pete Hegseth's defense and saying outright that these are absolutely untrue stories. And the people that are coming out to say that are Purple Heart recipients who are willing to attach their name to what they're saying. So I'm sorry, but those scales don't even out. So at this point, unless there is some serious evidence that comes out to suggest that Pete is somehow unfit for the appointment, yes, I still fully support him, and I wanted to say that on the record. The second story I wanted to discuss is the case being heard before the Supreme Court right now about whether Tennessee had the right to issue laws that restricted trans treatments and surgeries, especially those that cause permanent, irreversible damage, should be restricted to people who are of age and not allowed for minors. And the Supreme Court is deciding whether Tennessee has the right to make that kind of restriction. I am against allowing these surgeries to be done on minors. If you want to know how I arrived at that conclusion, please go and listen to episode 37, More Than Life, More Than Myself, Part 3, Trans Surgeries on Minors. After listening to the stories of several people who are detransitioners, as well as several other people who still identify as trans that are all against allowing these procedures to be conducted on minors, who say that at the time they believed that they understood the choice they were making and what they were choosing to do to themselves, but actually did not, and are now living the rest of their lives with the consequences of that childish decision. Combined with the fact that we know indisputably, based on science, that the part of your brain that is capable of correctly judging and weighing long-term risks and making decisions is a part of your brain that is not even done forming until you are 25. So children are not capable, just from a biological standpoint, of having the part of the brain that they need to have in order to make those decisions. So I am against this being allowed for minors. There is a very small minority of people who disagree and feel otherwise. Joy Reid felt that she had to weigh in on this. She has learned nothing from the clear rising backlash against radical ideologies like hers, despite the nation sending a very clear message about that with the election results. And so she is just continuing to double down on every front, including this one. She recently said that if the Supreme Court allowed Tennessee to make this kind of restriction, that would be the same thing as Hitler exterminating trans people during the Holocaust. Can you hear yourself? I'm sorry, but that is a stupid argument to make, Miss Reid. After all, exterminating a group of people for existing is a very different thing from saying that not only can you exist, but you can also do whatever you want to do to yourself as an adult, but you have to wait until you're an adult. You can't do it while you're a kid who is not capable of fully understanding the choices they're making, or of knowing what they will want a few years from now, because kids change on a nearly daily basis. These are two very different things, and I find it hard to believe that it is even possible to have an IQ low enough to not see that. And if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, because Hitler seems to be the only word in your vocabulary, if any side in this particular controversy is behaving in a Hitlerian fashion, it would be the people who are sterilizing other people without their consent, which is something that Hitler actually did. And children are not capable of giving consent. That's why we don't allow them to join the military. That's why we don't allow them to buy alcohol. That's why we don't allow them to engage in sexual activity. That's why we don't allow them to do a lot of things until they're adults. So if anyone's going all Joseph Mengele here on the kids, it's your side. So if you're going to go on parroting your favorite word, Hitler, all the time, you might try reading about some of the things he actually did and knowing what you're talking about for a change. Otherwise, this Okie is going to keep educating you on the fact that your side is the one closest to resembling him right now. There were protests held in front of the Supreme Court by people on both sides of this issue, and Annette Bening, the wife of Warren Beatty, showed up to protest on the side that wants these irreversible surgeries done on children. Here's what she had to say.
I think the greatest gift of my life is to have kids, and to have a transgender child has made me so much more interesting, so much more wise.
Wow.
And for the Supreme Court justices, I encourage them to talk to their kids, their grandkids, their nieces and nephews. Because I'll bet if they really sit down and ask them, do you know trans kids around you? Do you have any non-binary friends? They're going to say yes. And they're going to say that this is part of the beautiful rainbow of human beings everywhere.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Supreme Court justices should decide what laws are or are not constitutional by talking to children. Really? That's the best you got. Okay, children actually don't know anything about constitutional law, so they should not be making Supreme Court decisions. But considering you're arguing that they should be allowed to mutilate their bodies permanently while they're still children and can't make that decision in order to create a wider rainbow of humanity, one that is still completely available to them as adults, is insane. But the reason why I played that clip is what she said at the beginning, which is having a trans child makes her a more interesting person. This is what is known as Munchausen's by proxy, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who are not aware, Munchausen's disease is where someone deliberately makes themselves sick in order to elicit sympathy from others. Usually they've had a sibling or a close family member that was terminally ill when they were a child and saw them getting a lot of attention, and it created this mental condition in them where they wanted that same attention, and so they spend the rest of their lives deliberately making themselves sick. Munchausen's by proxy is where someone, almost always a mother, makes her child sick in order to receive the sympathy that a parent gets from having a terminally ill child. These people do not view their children as individual people with human rights. They are accessories to be used to garner sympathy and kudos to the mom who is tormenting their own child. Women with this condition have been known to subject their children to chemotherapy and awful treatments that they didn't need, poison them. In the worst cases, they've killed their own children. In some cases, they've killed multiple of their own children in order to get the sympathy. This is an example of that kind of sickness. She did not say that her child is suicidal without these treatments, and that's why they should be allowed. She talked about herself. That having a trans child makes her a more interesting person. That's what's known as a Freudian slip. Meaning, where you accidentally said exactly what you meant. It just came out a little too honest. I know out in Hollywood, married to a Warren Beatty, that makes you a hero. But out here in the real world, encouraging your child down a path that will put them at 10 times the risk for suicide and will possibly have them receiving medical treatments that will rob them of the chance to become parents, and possibly even worse. Like I said before, if you want to know more about what actually happens in these trans surgeries, go listen to that episode. All so that you can be a more interesting person. That makes you an absolutely awful human being. And possibly even worse, it makes you an awful mother. Just for the record. Lastly, we are awaiting the verdict in the Daniel Penny case in New York. This case is very important to me and to a lot of people, so I've been following it. It is an absolute blatant miscarriage of justice that this trial is even happening at all. Daniel Penny is a 24-year-old ex-Marine who served his country. He was minding his own business on the subway in New York City when a homeless man, a known schizophrenic, who had a history of violently attacking innocent strangers at random on a regular basis and was repeatedly turned loose after doing so onto the streets again, who was high on synthetic marijuana, which is closer to heroin than marijuana, and he got on a subway car full of people, including women and children, and declared that he didn't care if he ended up in jail, threatening that someone is going to die today. And he began terrifying everyone on board. This young Marine heroically chose to be a good Samaritan and put his life on the line to save his fellow passengers that day. He used his military training to put this homeless man, George Neely, in a headlock to cut off the blood flow to his brain, not his airway, the blood flow, which he did correctly in accordance with his training in order to cause him to pass out. Jordan Neely fought all the way through this encounter up until the moment he passed out. So it's not like he ever stopped fighting and gave Daniel Penny a chance to ease up. He fought up until the moment he passed out. As soon as he passed out, he was released from the headlock. He was alive. They called the police and they called the medics. When they arrived, they verified that he was still alive. This man was diagnosed with sickle cell disease and probably had other health problems from living as and being in the condition of a homeless person. He had serious drugs in his system. It is not even clear what he died from. There are experts on both sides of this trial. One says it was the headlock. The other says, no, it was the synthetic drugs in his system, which he chose voluntarily to take. So there's not even a consensus that he died at someone else's hands at all, as opposed to his dying of his own accord. But even if he did die as a result of Daniel Penny putting him in a chokehold, you want to know how you don't end up with a Marine putting you in a chokehold? You don't choose to take drugs and get high, and then choose again to go out among the public in that state, and then choose a third time to threaten to kill people, wanting them to believe you, and then get to be held up as the victims somehow when they do believe you and act accordingly and proportionally, taking that threat to their lives seriously. What happened is Jordan Neely's fault. And it is the state of New York's fault for repeatedly releasing a man who was not capable of controlling himself because he was a schizophrenic back out into the population, despite his clear danger to others and to himself, instead of helping him to get treatment. They should have protected society, and they should have protected Jordan Neely from Jordan Neely. The fact that this case has been allowed to go forward that the courts have been allowed to be weaponized to torment Daniel Penny in this way, who did a good thing, is an absolute travesty. It is a blatant miscarriage of everything that justice stands for, and it is an abuse of our systems of power. It is completely upside down. And it just makes it where those rare heroes among us who are willing to risk their lives to save complete strangers in order to protect people like me who cannot defend themselves in a situation like that, even more hesitant to do so, because even if they don't lose their life, which they are risking to protect a stranger, then they're going to be sent to jail by politically motivated activists who will put them on trial. Here is an example of how warped the minds of these activists are. This is the prosecutor in Daniel's case, talking about why she did not choose to aggressively prosecute a different case.
I had a murder case where the defendant did not intentionally kill the victim. He went into an ATM on the Upper West Side and tried to rob an individual. Unfortunately, it was an older individual. He was 86, and in the course of the robbery, he fell to the ground, and as a result, he died. This is, under the law, a felony murder, which is akin to intentional murder. However, when I first got the case, I took the time to learn about the defendant, and it was a strong case, so it wasn't about a whodunit. I knew immediately who did it. I could prove it. I could take it to trial that day and win it. But it wasn't about that. It was that the more I learned about the defendant and his life and the circumstances, the kinds of things that Jarrell was talking about, that one should take into account the trauma of that individual, I really felt incredibly sorry for him that he had gotten to that point in his life where he felt like there was no other choice but to commit this robbery.
Okay, so here's what you need to know about that case. She is talking about a man who chose to go out and commit a violent robbery. No one made him do it. He did it, of his own free will. Entirely his choice. Then he chose, during the course of that robbery, to bash an 86-year-old man in the head so hard that it knocked him down. The man did not fall down during the course of the robbery. He was bashed in the head and violently knocked down by the perpetrator. And then he died as a result. She says that we should not feel sorry for that poor 86-year-old man who did nothing wrong and did not deserve to die that way. No. We should feel sorry for the man who was the only one who had any choice in the matter, and who every step of the way chose to commit a violent crime. He will be eligible for parole next year because she did not prosecute him according to the law, which says that if you kill someone, deliberately or not, or even if you're not the killer, but someone dies during the course of you choosing to commit a felony, you are responsible for that death. She said, I don't care what the law says. My personal beliefs are what matter more. And I feel sorry for this man because he's black. And therefore, he's traumatized through some sort of mystical voodoo by what may have happened to his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And therefore, he's entitled to take the life of an innocent person. Now, you should know that the victim that he killed is also a person of color. He was an Asian man. But that doesn't matter either. This prosecutor is so noble that she wants everyone to know that she took the time to understand why this person committed this awful crime, and then chose not to punish him in the way the law dictates for it. But on the other hand, she didn't take the time to understand a Daniel Penny who never chose to do anything wrong to begin with, whose choices were to act nobly on behalf of others, not to bash an elderly man in the head to death. But we shouldn't try to understand him. No. We should sacrifice him up on the altar of the BLM activists out there who I'm sorry, but I'm not going to pretend that they're acting from good motives. They are not acting from good motives. They are acting from the very worst motives possible. Their argument is basically that if you're of a certain race, what happened to your ancestors gives you the right to lash out and harm people today who have a similar skin tone to some oppressor from the past. And you are allowed to harm them with impunity or even kill them. And you should be allowed to do that without any repercussions. And their victims are not allowed to defend themselves. And if they try to defend themselves or defend the lives of the people around them, even if they are women and children, they should be thrown to the wolves. I'm sorry, but that is not an ideology that comes from good motives. That is an ideology that is based on the very ugliest motives imaginable. This is exactly why people are leaving places like New York City, because it's being run by crazy people like this. And whether they're crazy, or they're malicious, or they're stupid, which are the only three options for having a morality that is as inverted as this prosecutor's, it doesn't matter. All three options disqualify her from being in a position of authority over anyone. I think that every election that happens going forward, you're going to see people start to vote people like this out of power. Because there are some people who don't have the luxury of moving. They're too poor to move. And guess what? They don't want their kids facing an unstable killer just because it makes some elite in their ideological ivory tower feel better. And I hate to break it to the Jasmine Crockett's of the world, but a lot of these people are people of color. Because they don't want to die at the hands of a Jordan Neely either. I am praying that this jury acquits Daniel Penny, because they absolutely should. But New York is an incredibly upside-down place when it comes to justice, so we'll see. But the very fact that these people have been allowed to torment this heroic Marine this way and put him through all of this is an unforgivable abuse of power, and it's one that people need to remember, because presidential elections aren't the only ones that are important. People who are entrusted with power and behave this way need to start paying the consequences for that. All of these people need to be voted out of power absolutely everywhere, and we need to get back to sanity and a world that knows right from wrong. This is insane. And the people who are promoting this insanity, whether they're doing it maliciously, out of mindless stupidity, just going along with the crowd, or they're so crazy that their moral compass has never pointed north in their entire life, either way, they should not be in charge of making your Happy Meal, much less be in charge of the justice system. And I don't think they're going to be for much longer. Because if there's one thing this election showed, it's that people are fed up with this sort of stuff. They don't like the insanity. That's why even California had a massive red wave. That's why MSNBC is going under. It's dying. And the Joy Reids on that network are exactly why it's dying. Yes, there are a few people out there who are interested in hearing whatever insane thing she has to say because they share her affliction. But there are not enough of them to keep the network afloat. Because most people are sane. Which is why that network is dying, and it deserves to die. Any network, or politician for that matter, needs to be moderating and hiring people who actually have some journalistic integrity instead of a bunch of ideologues spouting the unhinged, murderous, Marxist propaganda of fringe radicals that are not shared by the public at large, according to every poll. You would think that a college education would include learning how simple numbers work. But apparently not. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come back next week. Until then, have a good week, my friends.